Most people believe trauma simply leaves scars that fade over time. But what they fail to see is that it doesn't just hurt you, it rewires the way you see everything around you. If you are a trauma-born empath, you already know this without needing it. Explained, you walk into a room, and before a single word is spoken, you can feel that something is off. You hear someone say the right thing, but your attention locks onto the hesitation in their voice, the pause that lasts just a second too long, the subtle mismatch between what they say and what they mean. From the outside, people call this being too sensitive, overthinking, reading too much into things, but that interpretation misses the truth entirely. You are not reacting more than everyone else. You are detecting more than everyone else, because at some point in your life, reading people was not a skill you chose to develop. It was something you had to learn in order to stay safe. When you grow up in an environment where emotions are unpredictable, where the tone of a room can shift without warning, your brain does not have the luxury of staying passive. It adapts, and it adapts fast. You do not learn to trust words. You learn to read everything around them. The silence before a response, the slight tightening in someone's face, the way their voice changes when something is being hidden, this is not something you consciously decide to do. It happens automatically because your safety at some point depended on it. There is a difference between listening to what is being said and scanning for what is actually meant. And if you have lived in that kind of environment long enough, scanning becomes your default state. You are not just present in conversations, you are analyzing them in real time. Breaking down layers most people never even notice, and over time that turns into a kind of awareness that feels almost instinctive. I remember observing someone who described their childhood as calm on the surface, but when you listen closely, there were gaps in the story, and those gaps told you everything. They said they could tell exactly when tension was building in their house, not because anyone said anything directly, but because the energy changed in ways that were subtle, almost invisible to an outside observer. A door would close a little harder, footsteps would become slightly heavier, conversations would shorten, and in those small shifts, they learned to predict what was coming next. That is how hyper-awareness is built, not through theory, but through repetition under pressure. The brain begins to catalog patterns, not in a casual way, but in a survival-driven way, because missing those signals once could mean being caught off guard, and being caught off guard was never safe. This is why calling it overthinking is inaccurate, because overthinking suggests unnecessary complexity, but what is happening here is efficiency. The brain is doing exactly what it was trained to do. It is identifying patterns, detecting inconsistencies, and mapping behavior based on previous experience. When someone says one thing but their tone suggests something else, your attention goes to the mismatch immediately. Not because you are suspicious by nature, but because your system has learned that mismatches matter. When someone smiles, but their eyes do not align with that expression, you register it without effort. And once you register it, you cannot unsee it. That is the part most people do not understand. This level of awareness is not something you can turn off at will. It runs in the background, constantly updating, constantly scanning, constantly interpreting. Over time, this creates a unique way of moving through the world. While most people take interactions at face value, you are processing multiple layers simultaneously. What is being said? What is being avoided? What is being implied? And what is being felt beneath all of it? That layered processing can make simple interactions feel complex, not because you are complicating them, but because you are aware of more variables. You notice hesitation, where others hear confidence. You notice discomfort, where others see politeness. And you notice tension before it becomes visible. From the outside, this can look like sensitivity, but in reality, it is precision. It is the result of a system that has been trained to detect early signals rather than react to obvious ones. There is also a reason why this awareness often develops alongside a strong ability to anticipate. When your brain is constantly collecting data about behavior, it begins to project forward. It tries to predict outcomes before they happen. Because prediction is control, and control reduces uncertainty. If you can see where a situation is going, you can adjust before it escalates. You can shift your tone, change your behavior, or remove yourself entirely. This is how adaptability forms, not as a personality trait, but as a response to instability. You become someone who can read a situation quickly and adjust just as quickly, but that adaptability comes from a place of needing to maintain stability, not from a place of ease. The important thing to understand is that none of this is accidental, it is not random, and it is not a flaw. It is a system that was built with a purpose, and that purpose was survival. The problem is not the awareness itself. The problem is that it continues long after the environment that required it is gone. Your brain does not automatically downgrade that sensitivity. It keeps running the same pattern because it has learned that this level of vigilance works. So you carry it into every interaction, every relationship, every room you enter, even when it is no longer necessary. And that is where the misunderstanding begins. Because people see the output of that system without understanding the origin of it. They see someone who is always reading between the lines, always noticing subtle shifts, always aware of emotional undercurrents, and they assume it is a personality quirk, when in reality, it is a survival pattern that never got turned off. At first, this level of awareness looks like an advantage, and in many ways it is. You can read people quickly. You can detect problems early. You can navigate complex emotional environments better than most. But what almost no one tells you is that awareness alone is not what creates the problem. It is what happens next. Because for a trauma-born empath, recognition does not stop at observation. It turns into absorption. You do not just notice that someone is stressed. You feel it settle into your body. You do not just see that someone is angry. You carry the tension of it even after the interaction is over. And you do not just recognize sadness. You take on the emotional weight of it as if it were your responsibility to hold. This is where the boundary most people rely on simply does not exist, because your system was never trained to separate what belongs to you from what belongs to someone else. Over time, this creates a constant internal load that is difficult to explain to anyone who has not experienced it. Imagine moving through your day, not only managing your own thoughts and emotions, but also processing fragments of everyone else's. Every conversation leaves a residue. Every interaction adds another layer, and nothing fully resets. You leave a room, but the emotional atmosphere of that room does not leave you. It stays in your system, circulating in the background, influencing how you feel long after the moment has passed. This is why you can feel exhausted without a clear reason. Because the source of that exhaustion is not always visible. It is cumulative. It builds quietly over time until your baseline state becomes heavier than it should be. This is also where your behavior begins to shift in ways that seem subtle at first but become deeply ingrained. When you can feel tension before it escalates, you start adjusting yourself preemptively. You soften your tone. You choose your words more carefully. You avoid certain topics. You become hyper-aware of how your presence might impact the emotional balance of the situation. You are no longer just participating in interactions. You are managing them, often without realizing it. And the more you do this, the more you reinforce the idea that it is your role to keep things stable, to prevent discomfort, to absorb what others cannot handle. The environment becomes something you feel responsible for. Even when no one has explicitly asked you to take on that role, there is a quiet shift that happens here that is easy to miss. You move from being aware of emotions to being accountable for them. If someone is upset, you feel the urge to fix it. If someone is distant, you feel the need to understand it. If someone is struggling, you step in without being invited, not because you are trying to control anything, but because your system has learned that unresolved emotional states are a threat to stability. So you intervene, you adjust, you absorb, and you carry. And over time, this becomes automatic. You do not question it, because it feels like the natural way to exist. But what you are actually doing is taking on weight that was never yours to begin with. This is where the fatigue becomes more than just physical. It becomes psychological. You begin to feel drained, not by what you are doing, but by what you are holding. There is a difference between being tired and being depleted, and depletion comes from giving energy that is not being replenished. When you are constantly absorbing the emotional states of others, there is no clear point where you return to yourself, because your internal space is always partially occupied by something external. This makes rest less effective because even when you are alone, your mind is still processing what you have already taken in, replaying conversations, analyzing interactions, trying to resolve things that may not even involve you directly. The most difficult part is that from the outside, none of this is visible. You can appear calm, composed, even emotionally stable, because you have learned how to manage everything internally. People may even see you as strong, as someone who can handle a lot, someone who is always there, always understanding, always steady. But that perception hides the cost, because what they are seeing is the result of constant regulation, not the absence of pressure. You are carrying more than you should, but you have become so used to carrying it that it no longer feels optional. It feels like who you are. And this is where the real problem begins, not in the awareness itself, but in the lack of separation between awareness and identity. When you define yourself through how much you can hold, how much you can understand, how much you can absorb, you start to lose track of where you end and other people begin. The line becomes blurred, and once that line is unclear, everything becomes heavier because you are no longer just living your own experience, you are living fragments of everyone else's as well. That is the cost of turning perception into absorption. It gives you depth, but without boundaries, that depth becomes weight. After a while, something starts to change in the way you move through the world. Not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in a quiet, consistent shift that most people around you misunderstand. You begin to pull back. You start choosing silence over conversation, space over proximity, and time alone over environments that feel unpredictable. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal, like disconnection, like something is wrong. But from the inside, it feels completely different. It feels like relief. Because for someone who has spent years absorbing, processing, and managing the emotional states of others, solitude is not the absence of connection. It is the absence of noise. It is the only place where your system is not required to stay alert, where your attention is not split between what you feel and what everyone else might be feeling at the same time. There is a kind of pressure that comes with being around people when your awareness is always on. Even in environments that are not openly tense, conversations are not just conversations. They are layered, they require interpretation, they require filtering. They require a constant level of presence that most people never have to think about. So when you remove yourself from that environment, something in your body shifts almost immediately. Your breathing slows down. Your thoughts become clearer. The background noise in your mind begins to fade. It is not that you suddenly become a different person. It is that you are finally operating without interference. That is why solitude feels grounding rather than empty, because it allows your system to return to a baseline that you rarely experience when you are constantly engaged with others. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Because people who do not operate this way often interpret your need for space through their own lens. They assume that if someone spends a lot of time alone, it must mean they are struggling socially, avoiding life, or disconnecting from reality. But that interpretation overlooks the function of the behavior. You are not avoiding connection. You are regulating your nervous system. You are creating an environment where you can exist without having to process layers of emotional input that were never yours to begin with. In many ways, solitude becomes the only place where you are not performing a role, not adjusting your energy, not calibrating your responses to maintain stability around you. There is also a deeper layer to this, one that most people never articulate, but often feel. When your past has conditioned you to associate closeness with unpredictability, your brain does not automatically categorize connection as safe. It categorizes it as something that needs to be monitored. So even when you are around people who are not intentionally harmful, your system still operates with a level of caution, still scanning, still evaluating, still preparing. Over time, this creates a preference not for isolation, but for environments where the level of input is controlled. You become selective with who you spend time with, how long you stay, and how much access you allow. Not because you do not value people, but because you have learned that not all energy is neutral. Some of it drains you, some of it destabilizes you, and some of it pulls you back into patterns you have worked hard to understand. At the same time, there is a tension that exists beneath this preference for solitude. You are not someone who lacks the capacity for connection. In fact, it is the opposite. You are wired for depth. Surface-level interaction does not satisfy you. It feels incomplete, disconnected, almost performative. You want something real, something honest, something where you do not have to filter yourself or manage the emotional environment. But that kind of connection is rare, and your past has shown you what happens when you invest in the wrong kind. So instead of seeking more connection, you begin to refine it. You become more intentional, more selective, more aware of what you are willing to engage with and what you are not. This is where people often mislabel what they see. They call it distance, guardedness, being hard to reach. But those labels miss the reality. What looks like distance is often discernment. You are not closing yourself off from people. You are closing yourself off from chaos. You are choosing stability over unpredictability, clarity over noise, alignment over proximity, and that choice is not rooted in fear. It is rooted in experience. You have seen what happens when you ignore your own limits, when you stay in environments that require too much from you, when you give access without boundaries, so you adjust, not to disconnect, but to protect what you have already rebuilt within yourself. The challenge, however, is that this protective pattern can slowly become your default if it is not understood consciously. What begins as recovery can turn into avoidance if you are not careful, not because solitude itself is harmful, but because it removes you from opportunities to experience healthy, balanced connection. The goal was never to eliminate connection, it was to change the way you engage with it. But without a clear framework for how to do that, it becomes easier to stay in the space where you feel in control, where you feel stable, where you do not have to navigate the complexity of other people's emotions, and over time, that can create a different kind of imbalance, one where you are safe, but not fully connected. This is why understanding the role of solitude is critical. Not as an escape, but as a tool. It is a space where you reset, where you recalibrate, where you return to yourself without interference, but it is not meant to be the only place where you feel at peace. The real shift happens when you learn how to carry that same sense of clarity into your interactions, when you are able to be around others without absorbing everything they bring with them. When connection no longer feels like something you have to recover from. Until that happens, solitude will always feel like relief. Not because being alone is the goal, but because it is the only place where you are not overwhelmed. There is a tension that begins to form once you become aware of how much you are affected by the environments and people around you. And it is not something obvious at first. It builds slowly beneath the surface until it becomes impossible to ignore. On one side, you are wired for depth. You do not find meaning in surface-level conversations. You do not feel connected through small talk, and you are not interested in interactions that require you to filter yourself just to maintain comfort. You want something real, something honest, something where words and intent actually align. But on the other side, your experience has taught you that not all connection is safe, not all openness is respected, and not all emotional depth is reciprocated. So you find yourself in a position that feels contradictory. You crave connection, but you hesitate to move toward it. You want closeness, but you instinctively create distance. This is not confusion, and it is not inconsistency. It is a response built from experience. When you have invested in the wrong connections before, when you have given your attention, your understanding, and your emotional energy to people who could not meet you at the same level, your system does not forget that. It stores it, not as a memory you consciously revisit, but as a pattern that influences your decisions moving forward. So the next time you feel the potential for connection, there is a pause, not because you do not want it, but because part of you is already calculating the cost. You are not just asking, can this be meaningful? You are also asking, will this be draining? Will this require me to overextend? Will this pull me back into a dynamic I have already outgrown? This is where selectivity begins to replace openness. You start to filter interactions more carefully. You pay attention not just to what someone says, but to how consistent they are, how self-aware they seem, how they handle discomfort, how they respond when things are not easy. You are no longer drawn to intensity alone, because you have learned that intensity without stability leads to the same patterns repeating themselves. Instead, you look for alignment, something quieter, something more grounded, something that does not require constant management just to keep it functioning. And because that kind of connection is rare, your circle becomes smaller, not by accident, but by design. From the outside, This can easily be misunderstood. People may interpret your hesitation as disinterest, your selectivity as judgment, or your need for space as emotional distance. They might assume that you are guarded, hard to reach, or unwilling to connect because they are evaluating your behavior without understanding the context behind it. What they do not see is that your standards are not arbitrary. They are built from experience. You have seen what happens when you ignore red flags, when you dismiss subtle inconsistencies, when you prioritize potential over reality. So now, instead of moving quickly, you observe, you assess, you give things time to reveal themselves. There is also a deeper layer to this paradox, one that often goes unspoken. When you are capable of deep connection, superficial interactions do not just feel neutral, they feel exhausting. It takes energy to stay engaged in conversations that lack authenticity. It takes effort to respond in ways that feel socially appropriate but internally disconnected. So rather than forcing yourself into those spaces, you begin to opt out of them, not because you are avoiding people, but because you are avoiding a version of interaction that does not align with how you experience connection. This further reinforces the perception that you are distant, when in reality, you are simply unwilling to engage in something that feels empty. At the same time, the desire for depth does not go away. It remains constant, but it becomes more refined. You are no longer looking for just anyone to connect with. You are looking for the right environment, the right level of awareness, the right kind of presence. You want interactions where you do not have to translate yourself into something more digestible, where you are not required to manage the emotional atmosphere, where you can exist without constantly monitoring and adjusting. That kind of connection feels different. It feels stable rather than intense, clear rather than confusing, mutual rather than one-sided. This is why what looks like avoidance is often discernment. You are not moving away from connection. You are moving away from misalignment. You are not rejecting closeness. You are rejecting the kind of closeness that comes at the cost of your own stability. And once that distinction becomes clear, your behavior makes sense. The hesitation is not fear. It is awareness. The distance is not disconnection. It is choice. You are not closing yourself off. You are narrowing your focus, protecting your energy, and waiting for something that does not require you to lose yourself in order to maintain it. The challenge is that this space between wanting connection and being cautious about it can feel isolating if it is not understood. You are no longer comfortable engaging the way you used to, but you have not fully experienced what healthy connection looks like either. So you exist in that middle ground where you know what you do not want, but you are still defining what you do, and that process takes time because it requires you to trust something you have learned to question. It requires you to stay open without abandoning your boundaries, to move forward without ignoring your awareness, and to recognize that not every connection will repeat the past. Until that balance is found, the paradox remains. You will continue to want depth while instinctively protecting yourself from the cost that has come with it before. At a certain point, the pattern becomes clearer, not just in how you experience people, but in how people respond to you. And this is where the friction begins to show. When you are highly perceptive, you are not just listening to what someone says, you are evaluating everything beneath it. The tone, the timing, the inconsistencies, the small shifts that most people overlook. You notice when someone gives an answer that sounds right but feels off. You pick up on hesitation, on avoidance, on the subtle tension that sits underneath their words. And the important part is that you are not doing this to challenge them. You are not trying to expose anything. It happens automatically. But even without saying anything out loud, that level of awareness changes the dynamic of the interaction. Most people rely on a certain level of social masking to function. They present a version of themselves that is simplified, filtered, easier to navigate, and that is not necessarily dishonest. It is just how social interaction works. But when you are someone who instinctively reads beneath that layer, it creates a kind of pressure that is difficult to explain. It is not that you are confronting them directly, it is that your presence makes it harder for them to stay at the surface. You are noticing things they are not used to having noticed. And even if you never point it out, they can feel it. There is a subtle shift in the way they respond, a slight defensiveness, a change in tone, or sometimes a gradual pullback that happens without a clear reason being stated. This is where the misinterpretation begins. Because from their perspective, something about the interaction feels uncomfortable, but they may not have the awareness to identify why. So instead of recognizing the depth of perception, they label it in a way that is easier to understand. They call it overanalyzing, too intense, too serious, too much. These labels are not always meant to be critical, but they serve a purpose. They reduce the complexity of the situation into something manageable. If they can define you as the one who is too deep, too observant, or too complex, then they do not have to examine their own discomfort or the gaps in their own awareness. What is actually happening is not a flaw in you. It is a mismatch in capacity. Depth requires a certain level of emotional awareness, honesty, and stability. And not everyone has developed that to the same degree. When you engage at a level that goes beyond surface interaction, you are asking, without saying it directly, for a kind of presence that many people are not prepared to maintain. It requires them to be consistent, to be self-aware, to align what they say with what they feel, and that can be confronting if they are used to operating in a more automatic or guarded way. So instead of meeting you at that level, many people instinctively step back. This is why you may notice a recurring pattern. Connections start quickly because you recognize depth and potential almost immediately. You can see how someone thinks, how they process, what they avoid, and that creates a sense of understanding that feels rare. But as the interaction continues, the gap begins to show. You are still engaging at that same level, still observing, still present. While the other person starts to reduce their involvement, they may become less responsive, less open, or less consistent. Not because the connection meant nothing, but because sustaining it at that depth requires more than they can comfortably give. From your perspective, this can be confusing at first, because you have not changed anything. You are still being consistent, still communicating in the same way, still showing up with the same level of attention. But what you are encountering is not a change in you. It is the limit of the other person's emotional bandwidth. And once you begin to recognize that pattern, something shifts in how you interpret these situations. Instead of assuming that you did something wrong or that you need to adjust yourself to maintain the connection, you start to see that not every interaction is meant to continue. This is where a critical distinction needs to be made, because without it, you can fall into the habit of reducing yourself to make others more comfortable. You might simplify your thoughts, hold back your observations, or avoid certain topics just to keep the interaction smooth. But over time, that creates a different kind of imbalance, one where you are present physically, but not fully engaged. You are participating in the interaction, but not expressing yourself honestly. And that disconnect becomes just as draining as the original mismatch. The reality is that not everyone is equipped to engage at the level you naturally operate at. And that is not a judgment. It is a difference in development, in awareness, in capacity. Some people are comfortable at the surface. Some are just beginning to explore deeper layers, and some are not ready to confront what depth requires. When you try to bridge that gap alone, you end up overextending, compensating for what is not being met, and carrying the weight of the interaction by yourself. And that is where the cost shows up again. Once you understand this, the narrative changes. It is no longer about being too much or needing to tone yourself down. It is about recognizing alignment. You stop trying to fit into spaces that cannot hold you. And you stop interpreting withdrawal as rejection. Because the truth is, not everyone pulls away because you are too deep. Some people pull away because staying would require them to go deeper than they are ready for. And when you see it that way, the friction stops being personal. It becomes informational. It tells you where the limits are, not in you, but in the dynamic itself. Once you begin to recognize the friction in your interactions, a pattern starts to emerge, and it is one that repeats itself with surprising consistency. You meet someone, and the connection forms quickly, faster than what most people would consider normal. This is not because you are rushing or forcing anything. It is because you can read depth almost immediately. You notice how they think, how they respond, what they reveal without realizing it. And within a short period of time, you feel like you understand them on a level that usually takes much longer. That creates a sense of connection that feels rare, almost like you have skipped the surface and gone straight into something meaningful. But that initial clarity is only the first phase. As the interaction continues, your awareness keeps doing what it was trained to do. It scans, it compares, it looks for alignment between what is said and what is actually present. And over time, small inconsistencies begin to appear. It might be a slight change in tone, a delay in response, or a subtle mismatch between their words and their actions. These are not dramatic signals, but to you, they stand out clearly. Because once your brain is trained to detect patterns, even minor deviations become difficult to ignore. This is where the shift begins. While most people might overlook those signals or explain them away, you cannot easily unsee what you have already noticed. So instead of continuing with the same level of engagement, something in you starts to pull back. Not suddenly, and not always in a way the other person can see, but internally you begin to reassess. You question whether the connection is as stable as it first seemed, whether the depth you felt is consistent, or whether it was simply a moment of intensity that cannot be sustained. And once that question appears, the dynamic changes. At the same time, the other person is often moving through the interaction differently. While you are observing deeper layers and evaluating consistency, they may still be engaging at a more surface level. Or they may begin to feel a subtle pressure without fully understanding why. Maintaining depth requires a level of awareness and honesty that not everyone is used to, and even if they were initially open, they may start to withdraw slightly. They become less consistent, less present, or less willing to engage at the same level, not necessarily out of intention, but because it requires more from them than they are comfortable giving. This is the point where the imbalance becomes clear. You are still capable of engaging deeply, but you can see that the other person is not meeting you there in a consistent way. And once you see that, it becomes difficult to continue as if nothing has changed. The connection no longer feels stable. It feels uneven. You are investing attention and awareness at a level that is not being mirrored, and over time, that imbalance becomes draining. So the final phase begins, and that is where distance forms. Sometimes it is gradual, sometimes it is mutual, but the result is the same. The connection fades. From the outside, it may look like something that started strong simply did not last. But from your perspective, it followed a clear sequence: quick connection, growing awareness, emerging inconsistency, and eventual misalignment. It was not random. It was a pattern. The important thing to understand is that this pattern is not a failure. It does not mean you are incapable of maintaining connection. In fact, it often means the opposite. You are able to detect alignment much earlier than most people. Where others might take months to realize something is off, you recognize it quickly because you are processing more information from the beginning. That speed can make connections feel intense and short, but it also prevents you from staying in situations that are not sustainable. The shift happens when you stop seeing this as something that needs to be fixed and start seeing it as something that needs to be understood. Instead of asking why connections do not last, you begin to ask whether they were ever aligned enough to last in the first place. Because depth alone is not enough. There has to be consistency. There has to be mutual capacity. And there has to be a shared willingness to engage at that level over time. Once you understand that, the pattern changes, meaning it is no longer about forming and losing connections. It is about filtering them. You are not moving in and out of relationships randomly. You are identifying what works and what does not in real time. And with that awareness, the cycle becomes less confusing because you are no longer trying to hold on to something after you can clearly see that it does not align. As you begin to understand the patterns in how you connect with others, a deeper risk starts to emerge, and it is not something external. It is something internal, something that builds slowly over time without drawing attention to itself. When you spend years reading people, anticipating their reactions, and adjusting your behavior to maintain stability, your focus becomes almost entirely outward. You are constantly tracking what others feel, what they need, what they might do next, and that level of attention, while powerful, comes at a cost. The cost is that you stop directing that same awareness toward yourself. At first, this does not seem like a problem. In fact, it can even feel like a strength. You understand people deeply. You can explain their behavior. You can trace their patterns back to their own experiences, their own wounds, their own limitations. That level of understanding gives you clarity, but it also creates a dangerous blind spot. Because when you can explain why someone acts the way they do, it becomes easier to justify it. You begin to blur the line between understanding and excusing. You tell yourself that they did not mean it that way, that they are dealing with their own issues, that they are not aware of what they are doing, and while those explanations may be accurate, they do not change the impact on you. This is where the shift into self-abandonment begins. And it rarely happens in a dramatic moment. It happens in small decisions that seem insignificant on their own. You let something slide that should have been addressed. You stay quiet when something feels off. You give more time, more energy, more understanding than is being returned. Each of these moments feels manageable in isolation. but over time they accumulate, and as they accumulate, a pattern forms, one where you are consistently present for others, but increasingly absent from yourself. The reason this happens is not because you lack awareness. It is because your awareness is directed in the wrong place. You are so skilled at seeing others that you begin to overlook your own limits. You recognize when someone else is struggling, but you ignore when you are overwhelmed. You notice when someone else needs space, but you do not give yourself the same permission. You can articulate someone else's emotional state with precision, but when it comes to your own, it feels less clear, less defined, easier to push aside. And over time, that imbalance becomes your default. This is where empathy, without boundaries, becomes entanglement. Instead of connecting with others, you become absorbed into their experience. You start carrying emotions that are not yours, solving problems that are not yours, and taking responsibility for outcomes that you cannot control. It does not feel like a choice. It feels like something you are supposed to do, because for so long your role has been to maintain stability, to reduce tension, to keep things from escalating, but that role was never meant to define you, and when it does, it pulls you further away from yourself. There is a moment, and it often comes after a period of exhaustion, where something begins to shift. You start to question not just what others are feeling, but what all of this is costing you. You begin to notice how much energy you are giving compared to how much you are receiving, how often you are adjusting compared to how often you are simply being. And that question, what is this costing me, changes the direction of your awareness. It pulls your attention back inward to a place you may not have focused on for a long time. This is where the distinction between compassion and compliance becomes critical. Compassion allows you to understand someone without losing yourself in the process. Compliance, on the other hand, leads you to tolerate what you should not, to stay in situations that are not aligned, to continue giving when it is no longer healthy to do so. When those two are confused, you end up sacrificing your own stability in the name of being understanding, and that is not strength, it is imbalance. The shift forward is not about losing your empathy, it is about refining it. You learn to observe without absorbing, to understand without overextending, to care without compromising your own well-being. You begin to set boundaries, not as a reaction to others, but as a structure for yourself. You decide what you are available for and what you are not, what you will carry and what you will leave, where it belongs. And as those boundaries become clearer, something else becomes clear as well. You are no longer responsible for managing the emotional state of everyone around you. This is where you start to reconnect with yourself, not in a sudden or dramatic way, but in small, consistent choices. You speak when something feels off instead of staying silent. You step back when you feel overwhelmed instead of pushing through. You allow yourself to exist without constantly adjusting to others. And over time, those choices rebuild something that was gradually lost, a clear sense of where you end and where others begin. In the end, the goal was never to disconnect from people or to shut down your ability to feel. The goal was to include yourself in that equation, because empathy, on its own, is not enough. It becomes a strength only when it is balanced with awareness of your own needs, your own limits, and your own stability. Without that, it will always pull you outward, but with it, it becomes something entirely different. Something that allows you to connect deeply without losing who you are in the process.